Dust choked Cashin Vance's throat as he dragged the wounded scout across the slick canyon rock. Blood darkened the red clay. Tovik's breath came in shallow, wet pulls. Cashin's canteen was half empty. His ribs ached. He could leave him, the law said as much. But the Comanche's dark eyes held no plea, only a quiet, terrible waiting. Cashin drew his bowie, sliced the hardtack, and broke it in half. He pressed the larger piece into a scarred palm. The tracker swallowed without a sound. Moonlight bled through the canopy, turning grit to copper. Cashin wiped his blade on his duster. He knew the cost of mercy out here. Water ran thin. Rations ran thinner. The wind shifted, carrying the heavy drum of distant hooves. Cashin tightened his grip on his Winchester. If the wrong riders found them, neither would walk away. What would a shared crust demand when the midnight herd finally arrived? Cashin's shoulder burned as he hauled the dead weight forward, boots slipping on sun-baked shale. He dropped to one knee, the impact jarring his bruised ribs. The scout's leather coat clung stiff with dried sweat and old blood. Cashin reached for his bedroll, unrolling the stiff canvas with numb fingers. He didn't speak. Words wasted breath in the canyon. He checked the sky. Violet bruises gathered over the Palo Duro Basin. A dry creek bed cracked open like bone beside the trail. He dragged Tovik into the shallow cut, the earth swallowing their footprints. The scout's pulse hammered against Cashin's wrist, fast, erratic. Cashin unstoppered his canteen, letting a single drop fall to the dirt. It vanished. He poured another into his palm, then pressed it to Tovik's lips. The tracker drank, throat working in slow, desperate swallows. Cashin pulled back the leather flap on his rifle scabbard, feeling the familiar cold weight of the barrel. He counted his rounds, 3 left, enough for a standoff, not enough for a war. He watched the ridge line. Shadows stretched long and thin. A hawk circled, then vanished. The air grew heavy. Still too still. Cashin traced the fractured limestone with his boot heel, reading the faint drag marks left behind. 3 days without water. The leather straps on his saddle bags had shrunk tight in the heat. He unhooked a rusted wire snare from his belt loop, testing the tension. Broken fence line a mile back meant cattle had pushed through. Rustlers followed easy trails. He felt the scout's weight shift, a low groan escaping through cracked lips. Cashin tightened the tourniquet around the scout's thigh, the coarse rope biting into his own fingers until they cramped. Pain meant focus. The valley held its breath. Then a sharp crack echoed off the stone. Cashin dropped low, rifle stock meeting his cheek. A dead branch snapped further up the wash. The wind dropped completely. The scent of ozone and dry sage hit him hard. He waited. A single crow called, then fell silent. The pattern broke. Tracks emerged from the dust near his boot. Not horse, heavy tread, wide heel, territorial law. He exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. The tracks pointed toward the ridge, fresh and deliberate. They weren't hunting strays, they were hunting him. Cashin dragged Tovik deeper into the box canyon, the limestone walls narrowing to a choke point. Every step kicked up fine dust that coated his tongue. The scout's breathing grew shallow again, but his eyes tracked Cashin's every move. No words passed. None were needed. The ridge above them offered a clear vantage. Cashin climbed a weathered boulder, his boots finding purchase on slick rock. He scanned the horizon. Dust plumes rose in the distance. 2 riders, moving fast, heading for the wash. Cashin slid back down, his heart hammering against his bruised ribs. He uncoiled his rope, securing the scout's arm to a mesquite root. He checked his remaining ammunition again. The brass casings gleamed dull in the fading light. He wiped sweat from his brow with a frayed sleeve. The scent of rain finally broke through the heat. First drops hit the dirt like tiny bullets. Then the drum of hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. The riders crested the ridge. Leather dusters snapped in the sudden wind. One held a repeating rifle at the ready. Cashin stepped into the open, hands resting near his holster but clear of the iron. He didn't run. He stood his ground. The canyon floor trembled. Water began to pool in the shallow ruts. Cashin watched the mud creep toward the scouts' boots. Time was running thin. The wind howled through the gap. A sudden gust tore a loose wire from the fence line above, sending it whipping against the rock with a sharp metallic ring. Cashin flinched. The sound echoed like a warning shot. He checked the rope again. It held, barely. Marshal Sealer's Rourke reined his horse at the wash edge, spurs scraping against wet stone. He didn't look at the scout. He looked at Cashin. "You're harboring a fugitive, Vance." Rourke's voice cut through the rain like ground glass. "Turn him over or lose the deed to your land." Cashin felt the weight of every drop on his shoulders. The wind carried the smell of wet iron and old tobacco. He met the marshal's gaze. "He bled on my dirt," Cashin said. Rourke's jaw tightened. He unslung his Winchester, the action loud and final. Cashin didn't reach for his own gun. He stepped backward, pulling the rope taut around the mesquite root. He kicked the rifle scabbard behind him. "Draw," Rourke said. Cashin turned his back on the marshal. He dropped to his knees beside Tovik, tearing a strip from his own shirt. He wrapped it around the scout's shoulder, pressing hard against the wound. The fabric soaked through instantly. He didn't look back. "I keep him," Cashin said. The words hung heavy in the damp air. Rourke's boots hit the mud with a solid thud. Cashin felt the cold press of a rifle barrel against his spine. He kept his hands on the wound. The rain fell harder. Thunder rolled across the basin. The herd's stolen tracks would wash out soon, but the debt was already sealed. Cashin pressed his thumb into the flesh, feeling the scout's pulse jump beneath it. The marshal's shadow fell across the wet stone. Cashin didn't blink. He focused on the pulse under his fingers. The dark water pooled around his knees. A choice made in blood doesn't wash away. The mud sucked at Cashin's boots as he pressed the cloth harder against Tovik's shoulder. Rain drummed a frantic rhythm on the wet limestone. Rourke's shadow stretched across the pooling water. The marshal's rifle barrel never wavered. Cashin kept his back turned. He listened to the heavy breathing, the creak of wet leather, the low thunder rolling through the basin. He knew Rourke wouldn't shoot an unarmed man in the back, not with the territorial courts watching, not with the storm masking the truth. A sharp gust tore through the wash, carrying the scent of ozone and wet sage. Rourke's horse shifted, hooves slipping on the slick clay. The marshal exhaled, a sound lost to the wind. He eased the rifle down. The threat passed for now. But the valley's silence returned heavier, charged with the promise of pursuit. Cashin uncoiled the rope from the mesquite root, his fingers numb from the cold rain. He hauled Tovik upright, the scout's weight leaning against his chest. No words passed between them. The canyon walls offered narrow cover, a maze of fractured stone and twisted brush. Cashin checked his Winchester. The brass cartridges rattled softly. He moved forward, stepping over submerged rocks, guiding the scout into the deeper cut. The water rose past his ankles, cold and biting. Every stride demanded balance, every breath measured against the ache in his ribs. He tracked the faint drag marks left by Rustler boots, reading the fresh mud like a ledger. 2 days ahead, maybe 3. The debt of mercy demanded payment in miles. The trail narrowed where the limestone gave way to packed red earth. Cashin dropped to one knee, pressing his palm against the ground. The mud held a clear impression, a heavy heel, deep-toe drag, Rustler work. But the print angled toward the high ridge, not the valley floor. Someone had broken from the main drive. A scout, a watcher. Cashin traced the edge of the boot print, noting the fresh water pooling inside the tread. They were moving fast, but the rain worked both ways. It washed tracks, yes. It also drowned sound. The scout vanished into the brush ahead. Cashin stood, wiping his hand on his duster. The immediate pressure eased, replaced by a heavier certainty. He wasn't just hiding a wounded man. He was walking into a trap laid by men who didn't ask questions. The mesquite canopy thickened, branches weaving a tangled roof overhead. Rain fell in sheets now, turning dust to paste. Cashin dragged Tovik under a fallen ironwood, the bark slick and cold against his shoulder. He unslung his canteen, shaking out the last few drops. Empty, he tied the leather tight, feeling the familiar weight of scarcity. Tovik's eyes tracked the ridge line, his jaw set in quiet endurance. Cashin adjusted his grip on the Winchester, his thumb brushing the worn walnut stock. The wood felt smooth, polished by years of nervous handling. He checked the hammer, half cock, ready. The wind dropped suddenly. The rain stopped mid-fall. Silence crashed into the wash like a physical weight. A single crow cried out, then cut off mid-note. Cashin froze. He didn't breathe. He listened. The canyon held its breath. Then came the scrape. Metal on stone, spurs, slow, deliberate, not Rourke's gait, heavier, closer. He pushed Tovik deeper into the shadow of the ironwood, drawing the Winchester to his chest. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the wet earth. The scrape came again, closer. He raised the rifle. A figure emerged from the dripping brush. Leather chaps dark with rain. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low. No badge, just the glint of a repeater resting on a gloved forearm. The man stopped 10 yards out. He didn't draw, he just watched. The rain resumed, hissing against the dry leaves. Cashin kept the barrel leveled. The stranger's voice cut through the drumming water, low and rough. "You're walking into a box canyon, rancher," the rustler said. "Turn back while the mud still holds." Cashin didn't lower the rifle. He met the man's hidden eyes. "He bled on my dirt, I keep him." The rustler chuckled, a dry sound swallowed by the rain. He shifted his weight, the repeater resting easy. "That's a pretty sentiment for a man with 3 bullets and a starving scout." He nodded toward the ridge. "My boys are driving 400 head through the upper pass. You step between us and the trail, you don't walk away. Turn back, leave the Comanche to the wash." He spat into the mud. The gesture final. Cashin's thumb rested on the hammer. The rustler's posture remained relaxed, but his gloved hand hovered near the leather grip. The standoff stretched, measured in heartbeats. Cashin knew the math, 3 rounds against a dozen riders. He calculated the angle of the ironwood trunk, the slip of the wet rock, the scout's shallow breathing behind him. He couldn't win a fight. He could only change the board. He lowered the Winchester an inch. The rustler's shoulders relaxed. "Smart," the man said. Cashin didn't blink. The trails washed out past the ridge. "The drive stalls here, or it breaks." He tapped the rifle stock against a submerged stone. "You want those cattle down before the river floods. You need a man who knows the switchbacks." He lied smoothly, the words tasting like ash. The rustler studied him, rain dripping from his brim. He knew the land too well to buy a bluff completely, but the storm brought doubt. He nodded slowly, spitting again. "You lead wrong, you bleed out first." He turned, boots sinking deep, and vanished into the dripping brush. The sound of his footsteps faded into the drumming rain. Cashin exhaled, his hands steady but cold. He had bought time and borrowed an enemy's map. Cashin turned back to Tovik, pulling the scout from the shadows. The scout's face was pale, lips tinged blue. Cashin tore another strip from his shirt, binding the shoulder tighter. The fabric soaked through instantly. He checked the sky. The bruised purple had deepened to slate. The storm wasn't breaking. It was settling in. He dragged Tovik forward, following the Rustler's fresh tracks into the deeper pass. The ground rose sharply, forcing them to climb over slick boulders and tangled roots. Every step demanded leverage, every pull tested his bruised ribs. He kept his breathing shallow, conserving strength. The mesquite gave way to scrub pine, the needles sharp and fragrant. He smelled wood smoke before he saw it. Thin, controlled, a camp ahead. He dropped behind a fallen log, pulling Tovik into the wet dirt. He crawled forward an inch, eyes scanning the tree line. 3 riders circled a low fire, the flames hissing under the rain. Bedrolls stacked, horses picketed. Rustler camp, not a main drive, a forward watch. Cashin pressed his cheek to the damp pine needles. He watched their hands, no rifles raised. They were waiting. He counted the bedrolls, 4, 1 rider missing. The man he just met, the scout behind him shifted, a low groan escaping his throat. Cashin clamped a hand over Tovik's shoulder, feeling the tremor run through the scout's frame. He held his breath. The riders didn't turn. The fire popped, sending a shower of wet sparks into the dark. The immediate threat passed. The larger danger waited in the tree line. Cashin dragged Tovik backward, moving inch by inch through the mud. He didn't look at the fire. He listened to the crackle, the low murmur of voices, the shift of leather saddles. He needed the switchbacks. The storm had bought him an opening, but the camp blocked the direct trail. He had to circle high, cut through the scree slope, drop onto the trail below the watch. It cost time, it cost strength. It risked exposure. He chose the slope. He hauled Tovik up the incline, boots slipping on loose shale. The rocks shifted under his weight, clattering down the embankment. He froze. The murmur below stopped. He pressed his back against a granite slab, heart hammering against his bruised ribs. A rifle cocked in the dark. A voice called out, sharp and clear, "Who's on the ridge?" Cashin didn't answer. He pulled Tovik into a shallow depression, covering him with his own duster. He waited. The rain masked his breathing. The voice called again, closer this time. "Answer up." Boots crunched on wet stone, 2 men moving up. Cashin's hand found the Winchester stock. Checked the cylinder, 2 left. He didn't know where the 3rd round had gone. He counted it in his head anyway. 2 rounds, 2 riders, a steep slope. A wounded man. He weighed the choices. Run, fight, wait. He chose wait. He pressed his ear to the cold rock. The footsteps stopped 10 feet away. A beam of weak lantern light swept across the shale. It passed over his boot. It lingered. Then it moved on. The men muttered, curses lost to the wind. They turned back. The immediate threat receded. The slope remained treacherous. The debt of mercy demanded another climb. Cashin moved when the lantern faded. He didn't rush. He calculated. Every step placed his weight on the highest stone, testing for slip. Tovik's breathing grew ragged. Cashin adjusted his grip, taking more of the scout's weight on his shoulder. The pain in his ribs flared, sharp and bright. He ignored it. He focused on the next stone, the next inch. The scree gave way to hard-packed earth as the slope leveled out. He dropped Tovik behind a cluster of juniper bushes, checking the trail below. Clear, for now. He unslung his bedroll, tearing a strip from the stiff canvas to bind the scout's leg. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory overriding fatigue. He checked his pocket. A single copper button from a Rustler's coat. He'd torn it off during the climb. He rolled it between his fingers, the metal cold and smooth. It meant nothing. It proved everything. They were being hunted, and they were close. He wrapped the button in a scrap of cloth, tucking it into his vest. A reminder, a token, a marker of the line he'd already crossed. He looked at Tovik. The scout's eyes were open, tracking the ridge, no fear, only calculation. Cashin understood the silence. It wasn't absence, it was strategy. He stood, scanning the tree line. The trail wound downward, cutting toward the valley floor. The drive would pass there soon. The storm had delayed the herd, not stopped it. He could feel the vibration in the ground now, a low tremor beneath his boots, hoofbeats, distant, gathering. He tightened the Winchester's sling across his chest. He dragged Tovik to the trail's edge, positioning him in the shadow of a boulder. He sat beside him, back to the rock, facing the open pass. He waited. The tremor grew stronger. The rain thinned to a mist. The herd approached. The first cattle emerged from the brush, flanks steaming in the cool air. They moved slow, heads down, hooves sinking into the wet trail. Dust and rain mixed into a heavy slurry. Cashin counted them, dozen by dozen. Barty brands stamped into wet hide. Stolen, driven by men who didn't care about deeds or drought. The rustlers rode high on the ridge, shadows against the gray sky. They controlled the pace. They controlled the flow. Cashin watched the lead rider check his watch, then gesture forward. The herd tightened, moving into the narrow pass. He knew what came next. A bottleneck, a choke point, a place where a few men could hold back hundreds. He felt the Winchester's weight against his chest. He looked at Tovik. The scout's hand rested on a smooth river stone, fingers tracing its edge. A quiet habit, a steady rhythm. Cashin matched his breathing to it. In, out, steady. A crack echoed through the pass, not a rifle, a tree limb, but the sound triggered a chain reaction. The lead cattle panicked. They surged forward, hooves churning the mud. The riders cursed, horses reining hard. The herd compressed, shoulders slamming, tails whipping. Cashin saw the opening, the bottleneck. He stood, stepping into the trail. He didn't raise his rifle, he just stood there, a single man, against a stampede of wet hide and iron-shod hooves. The lead bull locked eyes with him, steam pouring from its nostrils. Cashin didn't move. He planted his boots. He raised a hand, not in surrender, in command. The bull hesitated. It snorted, it shifted left. The herd followed, splitting around him, finding the wider trail. The rustlers on the ridge yelled, spurring their horses forward. But the bottleneck broke. The drive moved. Cashin lowered his hand. He had bought the scout time. He had bought himself a target. The dust settled slowly. The mud held the shape of 100 panicked strides. Cashin dragged Tovik into the cover of a cottonwood grove, the bark smooth and pale against his shoulders. He checked the sky. The mist lifted, revealing a pale strip of sun cutting through the clouds. The storm had broken. The valley exhaled, but the danger hadn't passed. It had just changed shape. Cashin unstoppered his canteen out of habit, shaking it again. Empty. He tossed it aside, the metal clattering against a stone. He knelt beside Tovik, pressing 2 fingers to the scout's neck. The pulse was steady now, stronger. The hardtack and rain had done their work. Cashin wiped his brow with a frayed sleeve. He looked at his hands, dirt, blood, mud. He flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness in his joints. He needed water. He needed shelter. He needed a plan that didn't end with a bullet in his back. A distant horn blew, low, resonant, not Rustler, not territorial, something else. Cashin's head snapped up. He listened. The sound came from the high basin, steady, rhythmic. He knew that tone. It wasn't a warning, it was a summons. He looked at Tovik. The scout's eyes were fixed on the ridge. His lips parted slightly, no sound, just breath. Cashin felt the vibration in the ground again, not cattle this time. Horses fast, many. He stood, Winchester in hand. He checked the cylinder, 1 round left. He didn't reload. He didn't have time. He dragged Tovik toward the tree line, moving toward the sound instead of away from it. The horn blew again. Closer, the rhythm shifted. Faster, urgent. Cashin's boots sank into the soft loam. He kept walking. The horn stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. He stepped into the clearing. He saw them. They rode out of the mist like ghosts. Dark horses, dark riders, No badges, no Rustler brands, just the quiet weight of men who knew the land better than the maps did. The lead rider pulled up 20 yards out. He wore a fringed coat, the leather scarred by weather and wire. His face was lined, eyes sharp as flint. He didn't speak. He just looked at Cashin, then at Tovik, then at the Winchester in Cashin's hand. He raised a gloved hand. The riders behind him stopped in unison, hooves silent in the wet grass. The lead rider dismounted. His boots hit the earth with a soft thud. He walked forward, hands empty. He stopped 5 feet from Cashin. He looked at the scout's bandaged shoulder. He looked at the mud on Cashin's duster. He nodded once. A quiet acknowledgement, a debt recognized. "You walked him through the wash," the rider said. "You stood in the stampede." He paused, rain dripping from his brim. The valley remembers a man who stands his ground. Cashin didn't lower the rifle. He needed water. "I had some." The rider smiled, a thin crack in a weathered face. "Water runs out, blood does." He turned, whistling low through his teeth. The riders behind him shifted. Horses turned. From the brush emerged not riders but cattle, hundreds, maybe 1,000, Barty brands mixed with unmarked hide. A stolen herd returned. The rider handed Cashin a heavy iron key, cold and rusted at the edges. "The north pasture. The fence is cut. Drive them in." He turned back to his mount, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. He didn't look back. The riders followed, melting into the mist as quickly as they appeared. Cashin stood alone in the clearing, the key bit into his palm. The herd lowed, a deep, rolling sound that vibrated in his chest. He had paid with blood. He had been repaid in thunder, but the debt wasn't settled. It was just shifting. The rustlers would come back. The Marshal would return, and the valley would demand another price. Cashin closed his fingers around the iron key. He turned toward the north pasture. The ground was soft. The trail was clear. The herd waited. He started walking. The weight of 1,000 hooves followed him into the gray. "If you rode with me this far, you already know mercy costs more than a bullet out here." Cashin holds the herd now, but the iron key in his pocket weighs heavier than any deed. Before we cross into the next stretch, drop a like and subscribe to keep the trail open. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments. I want to see just how far this story has traveled, because dawn is coming and Marshal Rourke is already on the dirt. The rustlers will not let stolen cattle walk, and the valley demands a price for every breath saved. Stay close. The hardest choice has not been made yet. Saddle up. He started walking. The weight of 1,000 hooves followed him into the gray. The iron key bit into his palm, cold and unyielding against his calloused skin. Cashin dragged his boots through the wet loam, counting each step to steady his breathing. The herd moved behind him, a low, rolling tide of steam and damp leather. He didn't look back. The trail narrowed where the cottonwoods thinned into scrub brush, branches catching his coat and tearing loose threads. The north pasture fence lay 2 miles ahead. The wire was cut. The gate hung crooked. He knew the land well enough to feel the emptiness in the soil. Drought had starved the grass. Dust coated every leaf. The cattle pushed forward, driven by instinct and the quiet command of a man who had already spent his last coin. The ground sloped downward toward the dry riverbed, the clay slick and treacherous under the fading light. Cashin adjusted his grip on the Winchester, his thumb tracing the worn checkering on the stock. It was a nervous habit, a grounding rhythm born from years of standing on fences that might break. He checked the cylinder again, empty. He hadn't reloaded since the ridge. The brass casings sat heavy in his coat pocket, rattling softly with every step. He left them there. The scout limped beside him, leaning on a makeshift stick carved from ironwood. Tovik's breathing remained steady, though his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. His eyes tracked the tree line, scanning for movement. No words passed between them. The silence wasn't empty. It was measured. The herd spread wide, hooves tearing into the damp earth, mud splashing against Cashin's shins. He watched the lead cow step over a fallen log. He followed. The fence line emerged from the brush ahead, sagging under the weight of rusted posts. The cut wire glinted in the pale light. Someone had breached it days ago, rustlers or worse. He stepped through the gap, guiding the cattle into the shallow depression. The ground held, barely. A sharp crack echoed from the ridge, shattering the quiet like dropped glass. Cashin dropped to one knee, Winchester rising to his shoulder before the sound finished rolling across the basin. Boots scraped against shale. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, silhouettes sharp against the bruised sky. Leather chaps, heavy wool coats, the dull glint of steel resting on worn hips. Cashin didn't flinch. He held the rifle steady, stock pressed tight against his bruised ribs. The lead rider pulled up 10 yards out. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadows masking his eyes. He didn't reach for his sidearm. He just sat his horse, reins loose in the saddle horn. The other 2 fanned out, flanking the gap in the wire. Cashin's pulse hammered against his ribs. He knew the uniform, not territorial law, not rustlers, ranch security. The Barty Foreman, Elias Thorne. Thorne shifted in his saddle, the heavy leather creaking in the damp air. He looked at the herd. He looked at the cut wire. Then he looked at Cashin. "You're driving stolen cattle onto private land, Vance," Thorne said. The voice carried weight, flat and devoid of mercy. Thorne's hand rested near his holster, fingers curled loosely around the grip. "Step away from the drive. Surrender the Comanche to the Marshal's men. We'll hold you until the territorial court sorts it out." Cashin felt the cold metal of the Winchester against his cheek. He calculated the distance. 10 yards, too far for a quick draw, close enough for a rifle shot. But the cylinder was empty. The math didn't care about pride. He kept his aim steady. He looked past Thorne toward the ridge line. Dust stirred in the brush. More riders, waiting. The trap wasn't closing. It was already shut. Cashin lowered the rifle barrel an inch. The movement was slow, deliberate. He unhooked the hammer with a quiet click, letting the mechanism settle into the half-cock position. He didn't drop the gun. He just took the immediate threat off the table. Thorne watched the motion, his jaw tightening beneath a graying beard. Cashin met his eyes. "He bled on my dirt," Cashin said. 3 words, no flourish, no plea. Thorne's horse shifted, hooves striking a submerged rock. The foreman leaned forward, studying the rifle, the scout's posture, the mud caked on Cashin's duster. He saw the empty holster. He saw the shared canteen hanging from the scout's saddle horn, the leather cracked from years of hard sun. He saw the quiet certainty in a man who had already chosen his side. The wind dropped. The herd's lowing faded into the damp air. Only the sound of wet leather and slow breathing remained. Thorne exhaled, a short, sharp breath that fogged in the cooling evening. He raised his hand. The 2 riders behind him lowered their rifles, barrels pointing toward the mud. "Keep your wire," Thorne said, "but the law rides at dawn." Cashin nodded once. The immediate threat dissolved, replaced by a heavier, lingering tension. Thorne wheeled his horse, spurs clicking against damp soil. The riders melted back into the brush, leaving only the sound of fading hoofbeats echoing against the limestone. Cashin exhaled. He turned to Tourniquet. The scout's eyes were fixed on the ridge. His grip on the ironwood stick hadn't wavered. Cashin uncoiled a length of hemp rope from his saddle bag, securing the loose gate to a solid post. He tested the wire. It held. For now, he checked the sky. The gray was deepening to charcoal. Dusk approached fast. He dragged a fallen cottonwood branch across the gap, a temporary barricade against curiosity. The cattle settled into the shallow grass, their heads down, chewing slowly. Cashin sat on a flat stone, his back against the rough trunk of a cottonwood. He pulled a rusted tin from his pocket, checking the last of his coffee grounds. Empty, he tossed it into the brush. He closed his eyes. He listened to the valley breathe. The night fell heavy and cold, dragging the temperature down with the mist. Cashin didn't sleep. He watched the tree line. Every snapped twig sounded like a rifle. Every shifting horse sounded like a raid. He traced the edge of his boot with a calloused thumb, feeling the cracked leather. It was an old habit, a grounding rhythm. He did it when the weight grew too heavy. When the choices left no clean path, Tovik sat nearby, his back to a mesquite stump, his eyes closed. He wasn't resting, he was listening. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Cashin stood, stretching his stiff shoulders. He walked the fence line, checking every post. The wire sagged in 3 places. He tightened it, his fingers bleeding against the rust. The work kept his hands busy. It kept his mind sharp. The debt of mercy demanded vigilance. He finished the last splice, wiping his hands on his coat. He returned to the center of the pasture. He didn't strike a match. Fire meant visibility. Visibility meant targets. He sat in the dark. He waited. A sudden snap broke the quiet, not a branch. Wire. The tension in the fence line dropped sharply, the rusted strands unraveling with a metallic sigh that cut through the night. Cashin stood instantly, boots silent on the dirt. He didn't reach for the Winchester. He didn't need to. He stepped toward the gap, eyes scanning the brush. Nothing moved. The wind dropped completely. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. He crouched, pressing his palm to the damp earth. Vibration, faint, rhythmic, not cattle, not horses. Drums, low, steady. Coming from the high ridge, he stood. He looked at Tovik. The scout was already on his feet. The ironwood stick lay discarded. His posture had shifted. The quiet waiting was gone, replaced by sharp, focused readiness. Cashin understood. The valley wasn't just watching anymore, it was answering. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He moved to the ridge edge, dropping behind a cluster of boulders. He peered over the limestone lip. The basin lay below, swallowed in shadow. Then the sky broke. A sliver of moonlight pierced the heavy clouds, illuminating the ridge line. Riders emerged from the dark. Not 3, not 10, dozens. They moved in silence, hooves muffled by loose scree. No torches, no shouts. Just the quiet, relentless advance of men who knew the land better than the law did. The lead rider carried a long staff, a faded banner wrapped around the wood. Cashin couldn't see the symbol. He didn't need to. He felt the shift in the air. The pressure changed. The balance tipped. He stood. He stepped onto the open ridge. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He let them see him. The riders halted 50 yards out. The lead rider dismounted. He walked forward, boots crunching on dry stone. He stopped. He looked at Cashin, then at Tovik. He nodded. A quiet acknowledgement, a pact recognized. The trail was washed, the rider said. The rustlers scattered. He paused, rain dripping from his coat, water pooling at his boots. We brought what was owed. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the basin. The sound began low, a distant rumble that vibrated in the chest. Then it grew, hoofbeats, hundreds, maybe thousands. They crested the ridge behind the riders, spilling into the basin like a dark river. Barty brands, unmarked hide, stolen stock returned. The rustlers who had tracked them earlier fled before the tide, their shadows swallowed by the brush. Cashin stood in the open, the wind whipping his duster, watching the herd flood into the pasture. The ledger flipped. The debt cleared. The weight on his shoulders shifted, replaced by a heavier responsibility. He looked at his hands, dirt, blood, rust. He flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness. He had nothing left to give, but the valley had everything to ask. The lead rider approached again, stopping at the ridge edge. He pulled a small object from his coat, silver, tarnished by weather and old use. He pressed it into Cashin's palm. The metal was cold, etched with a single line of weathered script, a token, a marker. "The blood runs shallow," the rider said. "The pact runs deep." He turned, walking back to his mount. The riders didn't wait for thanks. They didn't expect it. They melted into the dark, leaving Cashin alone with the thunder of returning cattle. He closed his fingers around the silver. It bit into his skin. He looked at Tovik. The scout's eyes met his. No words, just a slow, deliberate nod. The immediate danger had passed. The larger reckoning had just begun. The Marshal would ride at dawn. The Rustlers would regroup. The valley would demand proof. Cashin slipped the token into his vest. He walked down the slope toward the pasture. The ground was soft. The air was clear. The herd waited. He started counting. One by one, the numbers didn't matter. The debt did. He reached the fence line, pressing his palm against the wet wire. The cattle moved close, their breath warm in the cold night. Cashin leaned his forehead against the post, eyes closed. He listened to the lowing, the shifting hooves, the steady rhythm of a valley breathing again. He felt the weight of the token against his chest. He knew what it meant: protection, obligation, a line drawn in the dirt that would outlast any law. He opened his eyes. He looked toward the eastern ridge. A faint glow painted the horizon. Dawn was coming. With it, the Marshal. With it, the court. With it, the test. Cashin turned back to the pasture. He walked to the center of the herd, standing quiet among the steam and leather. He didn't check his rifle. He didn't prepare for a fight. He just stood. He waited. The valley had given him everything he needed to survive. Now it would take everything he had left to keep it. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. He adjusted his coat. He faced the rising light. The first hoofbeat of the approaching law echoed against the stone. Cashin didn't flinch. He planted his boots. He held his ground. The debt was paid. The ledger was open, and the valley was watching. The hoofbeats echoed. A rider crested the ridge at first light. Dust plume cut the gray. Cashin watched the horse descend. It was not Marshal Rourke. The gait was too heavy, the saddle leather too fine. A man in a charcoal duster reined in 10 yards from the cut fence. He dismounted with a stiff groan, boots hitting the damp earth. He carried a leather folio, stamped with territorial wax, the seal of the county court. Cashin did not move. He kept his hand resting on the Winchester stock. The old habit of checking the grip had vanished overnight. His fingers stayed still. The man approached. He stepped over the broken wire. His eyes scanned the pasture, counted the herd, noted the mud-caked boots, the bandaged shoulder of the scout watching from the mesquite shade. He stopped 5 feet away. The morning chill bit through his coat. The rider tapped the folio against his thigh. He cleared his throat. The sound carried weight across the damp air. Cashin felt the weight of the paper. He knew what it meant: a clean transfer, a quiet surrender. The law favored the seal. The valley favored the blood. The man opened the leather flap. The parchment crackled. Crisp edges caught the pale light. Ink gleamed like wet stone. Cashin traced the line where his name should go. He thought of the hardtack split in the canyon, the silent nod in the mist, the silver token resting against his ribs. The paper offered survival. It demanded surrender. The man extended a heavy fountain pen. The nib glinted. He held it steady. "I am Julian Vance," he said. The cattle baron holds the territorial deed. Sign the transfer, leave the rest to the court. Cashen looked at the herd, mud on their flanks, breath steaming in the cold air. He unslung the Winchester. He laid it on a flat rock. He stepped forward. The damp soil gave under his weight. He reached for the parchment. His fingers brushed the crisp edge. The ink smelled sharp, chemical, foreign. He pressed the nib to the line. He did not sign. He caught the top corner instead. The paper tore with a dry, ripping sound. Julian flinched. The pen dropped into the mud. Julian's jaw tightened. He did not raise his voice. He stepped back. He watched the torn halves settle on the wet dirt. "You have brought nothing but trouble," he said. Cashen met his eyes. "The valley eats first." 12 words. Delivered under the weight of the morning light. "My fences can wait," he added. Julian mounted his horse. He did not look back. He spurred the mount toward the trail. The hoofbeats faded. The immediate pressure broke. The ledger flipped. Cashen picked up the Winchester. He slung it across his chest. He turned toward the pasture. The herd shifted. They moved closer to the fence line. Waiting, the brush rustled. Movement broke the quiet, not horses, boots. Men stepped from the cottonwoods. 3, then 5. Then 10, worn coats, frayed hats, empty buckets swinging from tired hands. They did not speak. They just looked at the torn deed, at Cashen, at the herd. An old man with a weathered face stepped forward. He carried a heavy coil of rusted wire. He dropped it at Cashen's feet. The steel hit the mud with a dull thud. Cashen bent. He picked up the wire, cold, rough, heavy. He understood the bargain. The valley did not pay in coin. It paid in labor, in shared fences, in quiet defiance. He nodded once. The old man turned. He walked to the fence line. He began to dig. Cashen joined him. He pulled the wire taut. He drove the staples home. The work grounded him. It pulled the tension from his shoulders. Every strike of the hammer sent a vibration up his arms. It matched the rhythm of his breathing. He counted the posts. He measured the span. He secured the gate. The physical cost mounted. His ribs ached. His knuckles split. He bound the cuts with a strip of linen. The blood soaked the cloth. He did not stop. He was not defending property anymore. He was defending a line drawn in dirt. The homesteaders worked in silence. No commands, no complaints, just the steady scrape of shovels, the clink of hammers. The valley breathed as one organism. Midday heat rose, the mist burned off. The sun beat down on the ridge, sweat dripped into Cashen's eyes. He wiped his face with a frayed sleeve. He checked the wire line. It held tight, secure. He walked the perimeter. He checked the posts. He reset the gate. He felt eyes on him, not hostile. Assessing, the scout watched from the shade, still silent, still present. The pact held. The herd grazed slowly, moving north toward the settlement line. Cashen stopped at the corner post. He leaned against it. He closed his eyes. He listened to the wind. It carried the scent of dry sage. Distant rain. The sky darkened. Clouds gathered, heavy, low. A sudden drop in pressure pressed against Cashen's temples. He opened his eyes. He scanned the tree line. Shadows moved, fast, coordinated, not rustlers, not marshals, farmers, miners, ranch hands. They rode in from the eastern pass, carrying shotguns, carrying pitchforks, carrying spare ammunition. They did not charge. They took positions along the ridge, covering the pasture, covering the approach. The signal whistle had gone out, sharp, metallic. Echoing off the limestone, it called them in. Cashen watched them settle. He did not ask for an army. He had earned it by tearing the paper, by choosing the herd. Julian's threat had bought him protection. The ripples spread. It moved through the settlement. It reached the dry creek. It touched the abandoned cabins. Doors opened. Boots stepped onto porches, men loaded rifles, women gathered supplies, children carried water. The quiet rebellion took shape. It did not march, it stood, it waited, it fortified. Cashin walked to the center of the pasture. He stood among the cattle. He felt the ground vibrate under his boots. The weight of the valley settled on his shoulders. He accepted it. He did not shrink from it. He adjusted his coat. He faced the ridge. He held the line. Sunset approached. The sky bruised red, the same color as the moon from the canyon. The firelight flickered in the distance. Cashin leaned against a post. His coat hung heavy. The silver token burned against his chest. He watched the riders dismount. They tied their horses. They did not speak to him. They began working, repairing the fence, strengthening the posts, digging a shallow trench. The valley moved with quiet efficiency. Cashin felt the ache in his bones. He knew the cost. He would sleep in shifts. He would eat less. He would face the courts when they returned, but tonight, the fence held, the herd rested, the valley breathed, night fell, cold settled, the wind dropped. A sudden stillness broke the rhythm. A wire snapped. The tension in the fence line dropped sharply. The rusted strands unraveled with a metallic sigh. Cashin stood instantly. He did not reach for the Winchester. He stepped toward the gap. He pressed his palm to the damp earth. Vibration, faint, rhythmic, not cattle, not horses, drums, low, steady, coming from the high basin. He stood, he looked at the ridge. The scout was already moving. The ironwood stick lay discarded. The posture had shifted. The quiet waiting was gone, replaced by sharp focus. Cashin understood. The valley was not watching anymore. It was answering. The homesteaders did not panic. They tightened the perimeter. They checked their loads. They waited. The drumming grew louder. It echoed off the limestone. It vibrated in the chest. Then the sky broke. A sliver of moonlight pierced the clouds, illuminating the basin. Riders emerged, not dozens, hundreds, dark coats, silent mounts. They moved without sound. They stopped at the ridge edge. The lead rider dismounted. He walked forward. He carried a long staff. He stopped 10 yards from the fence. He looked at Cashin. He nodded. Quiet acknowledgement, a pact renewed. He dropped a heavy sack at the wire line. Flour, salt, seed grain. He turned. He walked back. He mounted. They melted into the dark. The immediate threat passed. The larger duty remained. Cashin dragged the sack to the cabin porch. He untied the rope. He checked the contents. The grain smelled clean. The flour was dry. The salt gleamed. He closed his eyes. He felt the weight of the provision. It was not charity. It was investment. The valley fed itself. He carried the sack inside. He stacked it in the corner. He lit a single oil lamp. The flame flickered. Shadows danced on the walls. He sat at the table. He unbuttoned his coat. He placed the silver token beside the lamp. It caught the light, tarnished, etched, heavy. He did not touch it. At rest, he listened to the night. The wind shifted. The rain began. Days blurred into weeks. The storm broke. Rain fell gentle, steady. It soaked the dust. It filled the creek. It turned the gray earth to brown, then to green. The grass grew tall, thick. It covered the scars of the drought. The herd grazed. They grew fat. They moved slow. They bred. The lowing echoed across the basin. It replaced the sound of rifle fire. It replaced the sound of shouting men. It became the rhythm of the valley. Cashin worked the fields. He mended the tools. He repaired the roof. He did not sleep much. He did not complain. He felt the ache fade from his ribs. He felt the weight lift from his chest. He knew the cost. He had paid it. He would pay it again. The homesteaders returned to their land. They brought strays to Cashin's fence. He did not turn them away. He opened the gate. He let them graze. He let them recover. The ledger flipped again. Loss became community. Isolation became foundation. Cashin's name carried a quiet weight now, not fear, respect. Men nodded when they passed. Women offered bread. Children watched from the porch. He did not ask for thanks. He did not expect it. He worked. He watched. He waited. The valley moved forward. It did not look back. Summer deepened, heat returned, but the drought was broken, the soil held moisture, the crops grew tall, the cattle thrived, the fence stood strong, wire taut, post straight, gate secure. Cashin sat on his porch. He watched the dust settle. He listened to the wind. It carried the scent of cut grass and distant thunder. He closed his eyes. He felt the sun on his face. He traced the edge of his boot with a calloused thumb. The habit had changed. It no longer measured fear, it measured peace. He kept his hands still. He breathed slow. The silver token sat in the tin box. He did not need it. The valley remembered. The final image formed in the quiet. A single loaf of bread rested on the porch post, crusted, fresh, unbroken, left by a hand that asked for nothing. Cashin looked at it. He did not touch it. He let it sit. He let the wind carry its scent. He let the sun warm the wood. He closed his eyes. He listened to the herd. He listened to the wind. He listened to the valley breathe. The debt was paid. The ledger was closed. The consequence remained. If you rode with me this far, you already know mercy leaves heavier tracks than laid. Leave a like to keep the trail open, subscribe for the next ride, and tell me where you're listening from so I can watch the story spread. The quiet work never truly ends.